It should have been a peaceful evening walk. But for one blind, elderly man, it turned into a nightmare no one thought he could survive. Cornered, surrounded, with no way out, the coyotes circled closer, their growls vibrating through the cool air. Alone, defenseless, he had nothing but his cane and the sound of their claws scraping the pavement. Everyone thought this was the end, but what happened next defied every expectation. The hero that saved this old man's life will shock you to your core. Hit that subscribe button because this story will restore your faith in the impossible. Harold Mitchell, 73 years old, silver-haired, with hands that still shake slightly when he reaches for his morning coffee. 3 years ago, Harold's world went dark. Not all at once, but slowly, like a sunset that never ended. Diabetes had stolen his sight, one blurry day at a time, until the man who once repaired watches for a living could no longer see his own reflection. But Harold refused to let blindness steal his spirit. His wife Margaret had passed 2 years before his diagnosis, and his children lived states away, busy with their own lives. He could have given up, could have retreated into the safety of his small ranch home with its familiar furniture and well-worn paths. Instead, he made a choice that would define his remaining years. Every evening at exactly 6 p.m., Harold would reach for his white cane, a sleek, lightweight aluminum rod that had become his most trusted companion, and step out his front door. The quarter-mile loop through Maple Creek Estates wasn't just exercise. It was Harold's declaration of independence. It was his way of telling the world, and himself, that Harold Mitchell was still here, still living, still refusing to disappear. His neighbors had grown accustomed to the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of Harold's cane against the pavement each evening. Mrs. Chun from across the street would wave, even though Harold couldn't see her gesture. The Rodriguez children would call out, "Hi, Mr. Harold," from their front yard, and he'd always smile and wave back toward their voices. These small interactions weren't just pleasantries. They were lifelines, connecting Harold to a community that had become his extended family. That Tuesday evening in late October started exactly like the 847 evenings before it. Harold had counted every single walk since he'd begun this ritual, marking each one as a small victory over the darkness that had tried to claim his confidence. The autumn air carried that crisp promise of winter, cool enough to make his cheeks tingle, but warm enough to remind him why he loved this season. His white cane found every familiar landmark with practiced precision. Tap-tap at the mailbox. Tap-tap against the fire hydrant on the corner. The soft scrape as it traced the edge of the Johnsons' decorative rock border. Harold had memorized this route so completely that he could navigate it in his sleep. Every crack in the sidewalk, every slight grade change, every garden gate that squeaked just so, they were all part of his mental map, a GPS system built from sound, touch, and memory. "Beautiful evening, isn't it, Harold?" called out Tom Patterson from his garage, the familiar whir of his workshop tools providing a comforting soundtrack to the neighborhood's evening routine. "That it is, Tom," Harold replied, his voice carrying the contentment of a man who had found peace with his circumstances. "Feels like we might get our first frost soon." What Harold didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Maple Creek Estates was no longer the safe suburban sanctuary it had been for decades. Earlier that morning, Jennifer Walsh had spotted something that made her blood run cold while walking her golden retriever near the elementary school. A family of coyotes, 3 adults and 2 juveniles, slipping through the shadows behind the school playground like ghosts with teeth. Jennifer had called animal control immediately, her hands shaking as she described what she'd seen. When the county stretched thin by budget cuts, animal control could only promise to investigate within 48 hours. By then, the pack had disappeared, leaving behind only paw prints in the soft earth and a growing sense of unease among the few residents who knew what was lurking in their suburban paradise. The coyotes were hungry, desperate, and increasingly bold. Urban expansion had pushed them from their natural hunting grounds, forcing them to venture into neighborhoods where the scent of garbage, pet food, and easy prey drew them like a beacon. They were learning that humans meant opportunity, not danger. As Harold approached the corner of Maple Street and 3rd Avenue, his usual halfway point, something felt different. It wasn't anything he could put his finger on at first, just an absence where something should have been. The evening symphony he'd grown to expect was missing key instruments. Where were the Hendersons' two terriers, who always barked their greeting from behind their chain-link fence? Why wasn't he hearing the familiar bounce of a basketball from the driveway, 3 houses down, where teenage Marcus practiced his free throws every evening without fail? Even the urban soundtrack of distant traffic seemed muted, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Harold paused, his cane stopping mid-tap against the sidewalk. His other senses, sharpened by years of blindness, were screaming warnings that his logical mind tried to dismiss. The air smelled different, wilder, with an undercurrent of musk that didn't belong in suburbia. And underneath the normal evening sounds of distant lawnmowers and air conditioning units, there was something else. A low, guttural rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Harold tilted his head, straining to identify the sound. It was almost like a dog growling, but deeper, more primal. His grip tightened on his cane as a chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the October air. Probably just someone's dog having a bad day, he whispered to himself. But even as he said it, Harold Mitchell, a man who had learned to trust his instincts in a world he couldn't see, knew that whatever was making that sound wasn't someone's beloved pet. He had no way of knowing that 4 sets of yellow eyes were already watching him from the shadows, calculating distance and weakness with the cold precision of apex predators who had just found their evening meal. What none of them knew was that Harold Mitchell's peaceful evening routine was about to become a fight for survival that would test every ounce of courage he had left. The nightmare was no longer coming. It was already here, circling in the growing darkness, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The growl that had frozen Harold in place suddenly multiplied, like an echo chamber of nightmare, sounds bouncing off the quiet suburban houses. Not one animal, several. His cane trembled in his weathered grip as the horrifying reality crashed over him like ice water. His ears, trained by 3 years of navigating a sightless world, were telling him something his mind desperately wanted to reject. He was surrounded. The distinct pad of 4 separate sets of paws moved across the asphalt in a coordinated pattern that spoke of pack intelligence, of predators who had done this before. The clicking of claws against pavement created a terrifying percussion that sounded like a countdown timer to disaster. Each step was deliberate, calculated, closing off his escape routes with the precision of apex hunters who had been perfecting this dance for thousands of years. Harold's breathing became shallow, rapid. His heart hammered against his ribs so violently he could feel his pulse throbbing in his temples. The familiar weight of his cane, which had been his confidence and independence for 3 years, now felt pathetic in his grip. A toothpick against wolves, a feather against the storm. The lead animal, Harold could tell it was the largest by the deeper tone of its growl, had positioned itself directly in front of him, maybe 8 feet away. To his left, another set of paws had stopped moving, settling into a hunting crouch that Harold could sense even without seeing it. Behind him, a third predator breathed with the rhythm of barely contained violence. And to his right, the 4th member of this nightmare pack completed the circle. They were coyotes, though Harold couldn't know that. All he knew was the smell, wild, musky, carrying the scent of dried blood and something primal that made every human instinct scream run. But there was nowhere to go. His mouth went dry as desert sand. The cane in his hands felt slick with perspiration despite the cool October air. Harold Mitchell, a man who had rebuilt his entire world around courage and determination after losing his sight, was learning what true helplessness felt like. Instinct took over logic. Harold tried to back away from the growing chorus of growls, his cane sweeping frantically behind him for an escape route that didn't exist. 3 steps backward, his aluminum cane struck something solid with a metallic clank that echoed through the evening air like a death knell. A parked car. He was trapped. The cold metal of the car door pressed against his back like a tomb wall, and Harold realized with crystal clarity that his evening walk had become his final walk. Trapped between chrome and fangs, between suburban normalcy and wild savagery, his worst nightmare was crystallizing into terrifying reality. The lead coyote sensed his trap condition and took 2 steps closer. Harold could hear its breathing now, deep, controlled, the respiration of a predator that knew its prey had no escape. In the cool October air, he could actually see the animal's breath, visible puffs of vapor that reminded him how close death was breathing on him. The wild musk grew stronger, filling Harold's nostrils with the scent of something that had never known human domestication. It was the smell of wilderness, of kill or be killed, of a creature that saw Harold not as a neighbor or grandfather or human being, but simply as meat. Harold's heart pounded so violently he thought it might give out before the attack even began, and part of him almost hoped it would. A heart attack would be faster, cleaner than what these animals had planned for him. His hands shook uncontrollably now, the tremor making his cane rattle against the car door behind him like chattering teeth. "Please," he whispered into the darkness, not sure if he was praying to God, to the animals, or to the universe itself. "Please, not like this." But the growling only intensified, a rumbling bass note that seemed to vibrate through the asphalt and up into Harold's bones. The pack was communicating, coordinating, preparing for the final rush that would end Harold Mitchell's story on a suburban street where he'd walked safely for 3 years. A snarl built in the throat of the animal closest to him. Not the deep rumble of the alpha, but the higher-pitched sound of a younger coyote, eager for blood. Harold could hear saliva dripping on a pavement, could smell the carnivore breath that spoke of recent kills and an appetite for more. The circle tightened like a noose. Harold pressed his back harder against the car door, the cold metal seeping through his jacket and into his spine. His cane, raised in front of him like a feeble sword, trembled so violently it was barely a deterrent to a house cat, let alone 4 wild predators who outweighed him by hundreds of pounds combined. At 73 years old and blind, what chance did he have? His muscles, weakened by age and 3 years of careful, measured movement, were no match for the coiled spring tension he could sense in these animals. His reflexes, slowed by decades of life, couldn't compete with predators who killed for survival every single day. The alpha coyote lowered its head, and Harold heard the subtle shift in its breathing that every prey animal recognizes as the prelude to attack. Muscles coiling, weight shifting, the terrible pause before violence explodes into motion. Time seemed to stretch like taffy, each second lasting an eternity. Harold thought about Margaret, wondered if she was waiting for him somewhere beyond this horror. He thought about his children, hoped they would remember him for his courage rather than his gruesome end. He thought about all the evenings he'd walked this route safely, and how random and cruel it was that tonight would be different. The growling reaches a crescendo, then suddenly drops to an ominous whisper. Harold's grip on his cane loosened. What was the point? The white aluminum rod that had been his independence, his connection to the world, his daily declaration of defiance against blindness. It was nothing against 4 wild animals who saw him as their evening meal. He closed his eyes, though in his world of perpetual darkness. The gesture was more symbolic than functional. Harold Mitchell, who had fought diabetes, blindness, loneliness, and loss with unwavering determination, finally accepted that some fights couldn't be won through willpower alone. The alpha coyote's muscles bunched for the final leap. Its pack mates tensed in synchronized anticipation. Harold's breathing came in short, sharp gasps as he prepared to meet whatever came after this life. The attack was seconds away. The circle was complete. The trap was perfect. And at that moment, as Harold Mitchell pressed his back against cold metal and felt hot predator breath on his face, it seemed survival was no longer possible. This was how his story would end. Not peacefully in his sleep, not surrounded by loving family, but torn apart by wild animals on a suburban street where children rode bicycles and neighbors waved hello. The alpha coyote lifted one paw, muscles coiled like springs, yellow eyes locked on Harold's throat. This was it. The end was here. The alpha coyote's muscles tensed for the killing leap. Harold's breath caught in his throat. Death was half a second away. Then came a sound that changed everything. Crack! The sharp, metallic snap of breaking steel cut through the evening air like a gunshot, followed immediately by the thunder of 85 pounds of pure fury exploding into motion. From 3 houses down Maple Street, a sound that would have terrified Harold any other day became the most beautiful noise he'd ever heard. The earth-shaking gallop of massive paws hitting pavement at full sprint. It was Tank. Margaret Patterson's 3-year-old American Pit Bull Terrier had been chained in his backyard since puppyhood, a gentle giant who spent his days watching the neighborhood through chain-link gaps, tail wagging at every passing jogger, child, and mail carrier. Tank had never shown aggression toward anything more threatening than a tennis ball. But tonight, something primal and protective had awakened in his powerful chest. Tank had heard the growling from his backyard kennel, had smelled the wild musk that didn't belong in his territory, had sensed, with the ancient instincts that connected him to wolves and warriors, that one of his humans was in mortal danger. The chain that had held him for 3 years, a thick steel link designed to restrain a dog twice his size, had finally met something stronger than metal. Love, loyalty, the unbreakable bond between a dog and his neighborhood. For 3 years, Tank had watched Harold pass by his fence every evening, had learned to recognize the distinctive tap-tap-tap of the white cane, the shuffle of worn sneakers on concrete, the gentle voice that always called out, "Evening, Tank," even though Harold couldn't see him. To Tank, Harold wasn't just a neighbor, he was pack. He was family. He was worth dying for. The coyotes heard him coming, their ears swiveled toward the sound of approaching thunder, yellow eyes widening as they recognized what was charging toward them through the suburban darkness. This wasn't another coyote. This wasn't prey. This was something else entirely, something that had broken free from captivity to enter their fight. Harold felt the vibration through the asphalt first, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to make the very ground tremble. Then came a sound, paws hitting pavement with the force of a battering ram, each stride eating up distance at an impossible pace. The air itself seemed to change, charged with an energy that made the hair on Harold's arms stand up despite his terror. Tank was coming, and hell was coming with him. Tank didn't slow down, didn't hesitate, didn't calculate odds or consider strategy. He launched himself through the air like a furry missile, all 85 pounds of muscle and determination aimed directly at the alpha coyote that was poised to tear Harold's throat open. The collision was earth-shaking. Tank slammed into the lead coyote with the force of a linebacker, sending both animals tumbling across the asphalt in a whirlwind of fur, fangs, and fury. The sound was indescribable, part thunder, part explosion, part primal scream that seemed to come from the dawn of time when dogs first chose to stand beside humans against the darkness. The alpha coyote, caught completely off guard, rolled 3 times before scrambling to its feet, no longer looking like an apex predator, but like what it really was, a mid-sized wild dog that had just discovered what domestic breeding could produce when pushed to its absolute limits. Sound design becomes frantic, multiple animals snarling, claws on pavement, impacts. But Tank wasn't finished. The moment he regained his footing, he positioned himself directly between Harold and the pack, his massive head lowered, every muscle in his body coiled for war. The chain that had broken to free him still dragged from his collar, scraping against asphalt like the sound of armor being forged. The sight was biblical. 85 pounds of domesticated warrior facing down 4 wild predators, outnumbered but never outmatched. Tank's snarl was unlike anything the coyotes had ever heard, deeper than their own, resonating with thousands of years of selective breeding that had created guardians, protectors, soldiers in fur coats. "Back off!" Tank's entire body language screamed, though Harold could only hear the most terrifying and beautiful sound he'd ever experienced, the battle cry of loyalty itself. The pack tried to regroup, to use their numbers advantage, but Tank had shattered their confidence with that first devastating charge. When the second coyote tried to circle behind him, Tank spun with lightning speed, snapping jaws that could crush bone, catching nothing but air as the wild animal leaped backward, suddenly very aware that it was no longer the predator in this equation. One by one, the pack began to retreat. These weren't cowards. They were intelligent predators who understood when a hunt had become a fight they couldn't win. Tank's presence had transformed their easy meal into a war zone where they were outmatched by an enemy who fought not just with fangs and claws, but with something they'd never learned to weaponize: love. The Alpha made one last attempt to salvage the hunt, feinting toward Harold's left side. Tank was there instantly, moving with the speed of lightning and the force of thunder, his jaws snapping shut so close to the coyote's muzzle that saliva flew through the cool evening air. The message was crystal clear: "You will have to go through me, and I will die before I let you touch him." The coyote pack understood. This was no longer worth the risk. In less than 30 seconds, it was over. The coyotes melted back into the shadows as quickly as they'd materialized, their hunting party disbanded by the ferocity of a single domestic dog who had chosen love over safety, loyalty over self-preservation. They disappeared between houses, behind cars, into storm drains, anywhere that would take them away from the suburban warrior who had just redefined the meaning of courage. Tank stood panting beside Harold, his massive chest heaving like a bellows, steam rising from his overheated body in the cool October air. The broken chain still dragged from his collar, scraping against asphalt like a medal of honor. His fur was rumpled from battle, his eyes still scanning the shadows for any sign that the threat might return. But it was the silence that followed that would haunt Harold's memory forever. Not because it was empty, but because it was full of safety, full of salvation, full of the kind of miracle that reshapes a man's understanding of what's possible in this world. Harold's sobbing breaths, mixed with overwhelming relief. Harold Mitchell, who had thought his story was ending in violence and terror, found himself crying. Great, gasping sobs of relief, gratitude, and disbelief that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul. His legs gave out, and he slid down the car door until he was sitting on the cold asphalt, his white cane forgotten beside him. "Tank?" he whispered into the darkness, his voice breaking with emotion. The response was immediate, a warm, wet nose pressing against his cheek, followed by the sound that would replay in Harold's dreams for the rest of his life. The gentle whine of a hero asking if his human was okay. Harold had been saved by 85 pounds of pure love, and both of them knew their lives would never be the same. The silence that followed Tank's victory lasted exactly 17 seconds. Then Maple Street exploded into life as neighbors who had heard the commotion came rushing from their homes like guardian angels in pajamas and bathrobes. Margaret Patterson was first, her screen door slamming behind her, as she ran toward the sounds of battle that had awakened her from her evening TV show. Tom from the garage followed, still holding a wrench in his oil-stained hands. Mrs. Chin appeared in her doorway, cell phone already dialing 911, her face pale with concern for the man she'd watched walk past her house every evening for 3 years. Harold, are you okay?" Margaret's voice cut through the darkness as she spotted the elderly man sitting against her neighbor's car, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. But Harold couldn't speak yet. His hands shook uncontrollably as he reached down to find Tank's massive head, his fingers threading through fur that was still warm from battle. When his palm finally connected with the solid, reassuring weight of his savior, Harold Mitchell broke down completely. "He saved my life," Harold whispered through tears that seemed to come from 3 years of stored-up fear, loneliness, and overwhelming gratitude. "This dog I'd never even met just risked everything for me." His voice cracked on the word everything, because Harold understood better than anyone what Tank had sacrificed. The dog had broken free from the only security he'd ever known, had charged into a fight he couldn't win on paper, had put his own life on the line for a human who was essentially a stranger. Tank, still panting from his heroic exertion, pressed his warm body against Harold's side and let out a soft whine that sounded remarkably like "You're welcome." His tail, which had been still during the battle, began to wag slowly. Not the frantic happiness of a dog who'd been praised, but the steady, confident rhythm of a warrior who knew he'd done exactly what he was born to do. Margaret knelt beside her dog, her own hands shaking as she examined Tank for injuries. "Good boy," she kept whispering over and over like a prayer. "Good boy, Tank. Such a good boy." But her voice carried something beyond pride. It carried awe, the kind of reverence reserved for witnessing miracles. Within minutes, half the neighborhood had gathered on Maple Street. The Rodriguez children peered out from behind their father's legs, wide-eyed at the drama that had unfolded just steps from their front yard. Even old Mr. Henderson, who rarely left his house after dark, stood on his porch holding a flashlight like a beacon. They all understood, without needing explanation, that they had witnessed something extraordinary. This wasn't just a dog attack that had been prevented. This was a story that would be told and retold, a moment that had transformed their quiet suburban street into the setting for a modern miracle. Harold remained on the ground, not trusting his legs to support him yet, one hand buried in Tank's fur while the other clutched his forgotten cane. The physical trembling was subsiding, but the emotional earthquake was just beginning. How do you thank someone or something that has given you back your life? What happened that evening on Maple Street reminds us of a truth that our modern world sometimes forgets. Heroes don't always wear capes, carry badges, or even walk on two legs. Sometimes they wear fur and a collar. Sometimes they've been waiting their whole lives for one moment to prove that love is stronger than fear, that loyalty transcends species, that courage isn't the absence of terror, it's action in spite of it. Tank couldn't have known that Harold was blind, couldn't have calculated that the odds were 4-1 against him, couldn't have understood that breaking his chain meant abandoning the security he'd known since puppyhood. He simply heard someone in distress and responded with the kind of pure, instinctual heroism that reminds us why dogs have been called man's best friend for thousands of years. But this story isn't just about a dog's loyalty. It's about the invisible threads that connect us all in ways we rarely recognize until crisis forces us to see them. Tank had watched Harold walk past his fence for 3 years, had learned the sound of his footsteps, the rhythm of his cane, the cadence of his voice calling out evening greetings. What seemed like casual neighborliness had actually been the slow, steady building of a bond that would save a life. In a world that often feels divided by politics, economics, race, and ideology, a pit bull's loyalty had bridged every gap that humans create between themselves. Tank didn't see Harold's age, his disability, his race, or his income level. He saw only a member of his extended pack in mortal danger, and he responded the way pack members have responded since the dawn of time, with everything he had. The coyotes that had stalked Harold were following their own ancient programming. Hunt, kill, survive. But Tank was following an even older code, one that had been written into the DNA of dogs when they first chose to leave the wild and cast their lot with humans. Protect, serve, love unconditionally, die if necessary. As Harold sat on that cold asphalt surrounded by neighbors who had become family, as Tank's steady breathing provided a rhythm of safety and comfort, the true lesson of that evening became clear. Survival isn't just about individual strength or luck or even prayer. Sometimes it depends on the bonds we build without even realizing it. The love we invest in communities we take for granted, the heroism that sleeps in the most unexpected hearts until the moment it's needed most. By sunrise the next morning, Tank had become a legend. Word spread through Maple Creek estates like wildfire, carried by children heading to school bus stops, neighbors grabbing their morning newspapers, and social media posts that would eventually reach millions of people around the world. The transformation was immediate and remarkable. A dog that had spent 3 years as just another neighborhood pet had become the community's greatest hero overnight. Children who had been taught to be cautious around pit bulls lined up to bring Tank treats and toys. Adults who had once crossed the street when they saw him coming now stopped to pet him and thank him for his courage. Harold became Tank's most faithful visitor, arriving every morning at exactly 9 a.m. with a pocket full of premium dog biscuits and a heart full of gratitude that seemed to grow larger with each passing day. The daily ritual of their meeting, Harold's careful approach, Tank's gentle greeting, the quiet moments they spent together in Margaret's backyard became a testament to the unbreakable bond forged in those 30 seconds of terror and triumph. Local news stations picked up the story. Veterinarians offered free care for life. Dog food companies sent enough supplies to feed Tank for years. But the real triumph wasn't in the fame or the gifts. It was in the way one dog's courage had reminded an entire community what it meant to be neighbors, what it looked like to put love before fear, sacrifice before safety. Tank wore his newfound celebrity status with the same quiet dignity he'd shown during the battle itself. He didn't strut or demand attention. He simply continued to be Tank, loyal, protective, and ready to break every chain that stood between him and the humans he'd sworn to protect. Sometimes the most unexpected guardian angels have 4 legs, a fearless heart, and a love so pure it can literally move mountains, or break chains, or save lives on quiet suburban streets where miracles aren't supposed to happen but sometimes do anyway. Harold's story proves that survival isn't always about human strength or perfect vision. Sometimes it depends on the courage of others, the loyalty that transcends species, the love that breaks chains, and the heroes who show up exactly when hope seems lost. Have you ever witnessed an unexpected act of heroism? Share your story in the comments below, because the world needs to hear about real heroes like Tank. Every story of courage inspires someone else to be brave when it matters most. If Tank's incredible rescue moved you, smash that like button and subscribe for more unbelievable survival stories that will restore your faith in the goodness that surrounds us. Share this with someone who needs to believe in heroes today, because sometimes the best stories are the ones that remind us love really can conquer fear.